Welcome to Relax Story, a place where gentle stories help you leave behind the noise of the day and slowly drift into a peaceful sleep. Each soft, soothing narration is designed to relax your mind, release tension, and guide you to a deeper sense of calm within. If you enjoy the experience, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay with Relax Story every night. And feel free to leave a comment to share your thoughts or suggest a story you'd love to hear. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let Relax Story guide you into a restful deep sleep. Around 66 million years ago, at the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, in a moment when geological time seemed to collapse into a single point, a celestial body measuring between 10 and 15 kilometers in diameter tore through the void of space and struck the Earth at what is now Chicxulub crater on the Yucatan Peninsula, an impact that did not merely leave behind a crater nearly 200 kilometers wide, but unleashed enough energy to vaporize rock and seawater, sending shock waves racing across the planet, igniting wildfires that stretched across continents as though in that instant the surface of the Earth was no longer a living world but a burning map of destruction. Matter was hurled into the atmosphere, dust and ash spread outward, thick enough to block the sun itself. Temperatures fell, photosynthesis fell silent, food chains fractured link by link, and within that prolonged stillness, nearly 3/4 of all life vanished, including all non-avian dinosaurs. An era closed, and yet, as the vast and the obvious were erased, something else began to emerge, faint, almost imperceptible, like a small trace of motion within the planet's long shadow. Somewhere at the edges of cooling forests, along the margins of shallow waters that remained, within rock crevices or undisturbed pockets of earth, a small theropod lineage, close to the Troodontids, endured, not through strength, not through speed, nor through any immediate superiority of intellect, but through far simpler traits, a smaller body that required less energy, large eyes adapted to dim light, a relatively developed brain for its size, forelimbs flexible enough to grasp and manipulate crude objects, and above all, the capacity to wait, to endure, to remain hidden. The great creatures could not wait when food disappeared. The small ones could. From the depths of space where the object began its journey, down to the surface where fire and dust consumed the light, through ecosystems collapsing in succession and narrowing at last into a dark corner where a small group of creatures persisted in silence. The story is not one of triumph, nor of domination, but of a single remaining truth. A small group, a small chance, a span of time so fragile it almost did not exist. Not all dinosaurs survived. No new species rose to replace them. Only a small branch, fragile, nearly invisible, yet not gone. From that fragile persistence, a line of evolution was preserved, like a forgotten offshoot on the vast tree of life. And if that branch were to extend across millions of years, if from it memory were to emerge, then tools, then society, if capacities once only potential were to become real, then the question would no longer belong to the past. Would the Earth, in another line of history, still belong to humanity? In the first months after the impact in the region now known as the Yucatan Peninsula, light no longer reached the Earth's surface as it once had, but remained suspended above, scattered through a dense veil of fine dust and aerosols hanging within the atmosphere, turning daylight into a dim, endless twilight, before gradually slipping into something colder, darker, quieter, where temperate forests that once stretched across ancient North America did not vanish entirely, but fractured into isolated patches scattered between river banks, lake edges, shallow marshes, and layers of damp leaf litter still holding a trace of warmth from decay, while the widespread collapse of photosynthesis caused plant life to die off en masse, or weaken to the point where it could no longer sustain the large bodies that once depended on it, triggering a cascading collapse of herbivores, followed by the predators at the top of the food chain, until an ecosystem that had once functioned like a vast machine shattered into countless fragments, each fragment retaining only brief, unstable pockets of energy, fragile as embers left behind after a fire has burned out. In a world that had grown darker, colder, and quieter, the question no longer revolved around strength or dominance but shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward a different measure, lower, more fundamental, almost ruthless. How much energy was required to survive one more day? Within those diminished spaces, where life did not vanish but contracted, a small theropod lineage, close to the Troodontidae, existed as a thin boundary between survival and extinction. With a lightweight body, large eyes adapted to low light, quick reflexes suited for confined environments, and energy demands far lower than the massive relatives that had disappeared. Not a ruler, not a center of the ecosystem, but simply one among many surviving organisms competing for the scattered remnants of a world that no longer offered abundance, where small mammals began to expand their presence, increasing in diversity and size within the first tens of thousands of years, where early birds pressed into the same narrow ecological niches, sharing food, nesting grounds, and rare pockets of safety, all converging upon the most tangible energy sources that remained: insects crawling through leaf litter, small fish moving through cold water, crustaceans buried in mud, partially decomposed carcasses, roots still alive beneath damp soil, decaying organic fragments unappealing yet sufficient to sustain the faint pulse of life. Such a world no longer had room for large bodies that required stability, but began to favour smaller forms capable of adapting to uncertainty, organisms that learned to persist not within a complete ecosystem, but within its fragments. Along cold water margins, where mud retained traces of small creatures, beneath fallen, decaying trunks, or within shallow rock crevices, this hypothetical Troodontid lineage moved like low shadows, not seeking control but opportunity, scavenging fresh remains before decay spread too far, capturing surviving insects near the water's edge, digging through leaf litter in search of eggs or hatchlings, shifting toward an almost entirely opportunistic diet while vegetation had yet to recover, gathering, digging, snatching, and withdrawing before detection, avoiding open spaces where cold deepened and exposure increased, every action governed by a single principle: expend as little as possible, risk as little as possible, endure as long as possible. No territorial expansion, no pursuit of large prey, no display of presence, only a quiet passage through each day, each cycle of scarcity, each interval where food became rarer, colder, less predictable. Their advantage did not lie in strength, it lay in the cost of living. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly within the scale of a short life, a new rule began to take shape from those fragments. A rule that did not reward size, did not reward explosive growth, did not reward former dominance, but instead tilted silently toward those organisms capable of enduring hunger longer, remaining hidden longer, finding smaller sources of sustenance, surviving on lower energy rhythms, until species that had once dominated the late Cretaceous period faded like echoes dissolving into the cold, while small, overlooked, nearly invisible creatures retained their place within the new world, and among them, this hypothetical Troodontid lineage did not vanish with the initial darkness, but preserved something that could not be measured by strength or size. Time. Given time, all other possibilities begin to unfold, and so the question shifts, no longer centered on how to survive the first darkness, but on something deeper. Why this small lineage stood in a position to travel further than any other along the evolutionary path toward intelligence. Between roughly 66 and 60 million years ago, when the echo of catastrophe still lingered like an invisible veil of dust suspended in the air of Earth, ecosystems began to rearrange themselves, slowly, unevenly, without any shared rhythm, as though scattered fragments were searching for their lost positions within a once complete picture. And across the northern hemisphere, new forest rose in irregular patterns, dense and humid in some places, sparse and fragile in others, some already approaching a stable structure, while others remained only open gaps threaded between clusters of low vegetation. And along those damp forest edges, beside corridors of water, life returned in uneven pulses, swarms of insects appearing and vanishing, small creatures re-emerging with the seasons like faint, passing waves, turning the world from a fixed stage into a shifting labyrinth where yesterday and today rarely resembled one another, where a safe ground could become a trap within a single cycle of weather, and in such a world, strength was no longer the sole determinant, rigid specialization became a liability, while the ability to observe, to remember, and to adjust behavior began to emerge as a quiet but enduring advantage. Within that setting, a small branch of life appeared as a slight deviation in the flow of evolution, not remarkable in size, not dominant in strength, yet carrying traits that seemed curiously suited to a world in flux, as if its body had been written for an environment that had never known stability. The creatures of the Troodontid group, their compact bodies covered in feathers, were not merely simple theropods that had survived the catastrophe, but individuals possessing relatively more developed brain structures than many of their contemporaries, a brain-to-body ratio not large by the standards of later species, yet sufficient to open a more flexible space for processing information, where reflex was no longer the only option, where behavior could shift with circumstance, while their large eyes, adapted to low light, allowed them to move and hunt during hours when the rest of the world slowed, at misted dawn or in the thickening shadows of dusk, when the boundary between day and night blurred. And it was precisely within those transitional moments that the environment revealed the most signals, subtle movements, delicate changes, fleeting opportunities. Their evolutionary position was not incidental, for this branch lay closer to the lineage leading to birds than many other theropods, a proximity not to turn them into birds, but to open a different path, a form of awareness that did not need to mirror any familiar template, a path along which intelligence, if it were to emerge, would take on its own shape, unborrowed, unreplicated, while their forelimbs, though not as dexterous as the hands of primates, were sufficient to hold, to press, to pull, to interact with the environment at a basic level, like the first crude gestures of a capacity not yet named. Yet form was only the beginning, a latent possibility, an unfulfilled promise, for what truly shapes the path of a species lies not in what it possesses, but in what the surrounding world compels it to become. In an environment where food did not appear according to clear patterns, where shelter shifted with the seasons and with the recovery of vegetation, where prey came and went like unannounced waves, where safety and danger exchanged places without warning, creatures that relied solely on immediate reflex were forced to begin again, to repeat cycles of trial and error, to face constant risk, while those capable of retaining information, even in fragments, began to accumulate an unseen advantage, an invisible map of the world around them, where water had once appeared, where carcasses had lain, where nests were revealed in cycles, where the trails of prey repeated over time, and it was this accumulation, gradual and silent, that began to alter the way they existed. That change did not arrive as a leap, but as a subtle shift in behavior, when these individuals no longer hunted at random, but began to remember which banks tended to leave fish stranded after the waters receded, which burrows sheltered more effectively as temperatures fell, which areas revealed eggs in recurring patterns, distinguishing between a place that had food once and a place that tended to have food, a small difference with immense consequences for survival. While the small birds and mammals around them were no longer merely prey or rivals, but became living signals, indications of where resources were abundant, where danger lingered, and in a world where everything shifted in layers and fragments and unsynchronized rhythms, observation became a continuous act, nearly impossible to suspend, for any missed piece of information could mean the loss of a chance to survive. From that point, behavior was no longer confined to the present moment, but began to stretch across time as the memory of yesterday seeped into the decisions of today, as faint projections of tomorrow began to form, not as clear plans, but as tendencies, inclinations, conditional choices, a primitive form of awareness that was already enough to create difference, not stronger, but finer. The brain did not grow toward a named destination called civilization. It grew because the new world had, unintentionally, rewarded memory, observation, and even the most rudimentary forms of prediction, and from those rewards, memory became the first essential tool of survival. Observation became a new kind of strength, quiet, unassuming, yet capable of defining the boundary between existence and disappearance, allowing this branch of life to become more than a mere survivor of catastrophe, but another direction of evolution, where life did not simply sustain itself, but began to accumulate, to transform, to learn how to move beyond what the present allowed. If memory had become the first advantage, then the next step would no longer be mere survival within the new world, but the learning of how to adapt to it across millions of years. Between roughly 60 and 50 million years ago, as Earth moved beyond the final veils of ash from the past and entered the later phase of the Paleocene before touching the threshold of the early Eocene, the world no longer resembled a planet recently extinguished, but gradually became a body in recovery, slow yet persistent, where warm forests spread like green tides across continents, where river plains gathered silt and life, where humid corridors wove between shrubs and forest canopies like ecological arteries linking countless smaller environments. And within those spaces, small animals began to gather, denser, more numerous, closer together, like small heartbeats merging into a single, larger pulse of the planet. Recovery did not occur as a sudden rise, but as a sequence of waves, each surge of vegetation drawing animals in its wake, each layer of ecosystem stacking upon another, thickening, growing more complex, more diverse, until one truth emerged. Not through a single event, but through a trend extending over millions of years, that mammals began to expand their role, increasing in size, branching rapidly, filling ecological spaces that had never belonged to them before. Within that shifting picture, the hypothetical Troodontid lineage no longer stood in a quiet world left behind by an ancient impact, but existed within an environment filling once more, and it was that very fullness that rendered every gap valuable, every mistake costly, every opportunity fleeting. A more vibrant world meant a harsher one. As life returned, the question was no longer how to survive the next day, but how to persist among others that were growing faster, spreading wider, adapting more effectively, and becoming more numerous. In that context, the Troodontid branch was no longer a collection of solitary survivors fortunate enough to outlast catastrophe, but a species required to maintain its place within an increasingly dense network of competition, where small mammals move through layers of vegetation, exploiting every minor food source, occupying lower ecological niches with remarkable efficiency, where egg clutches could be discovered more easily, where once sufficient resources became divided, where safety was no longer assumed. Fossil evidence suggests that within a geologically brief span, mammalian diversity increased significantly, accompanied by rapid changes in body size and ecological roles, as though a network were being filled from within. Alongside them, small birds glided through the canopy. Snakes slipped across layers of leaf litter. Lizards and large insects crowded every corner, all at once prey, competitors, threats, and signals indicating where abundance lay and where danger waited. In such a world, Troodontids could not prevail through strength or size, could not expand territory through dominance, could not endure by repeating a single strategy indefinitely. They were forced to become quicker, to remember longer, to react more flexibly, to coordinate briefly with other individuals, to use simple signals for warning, for locating, for avoiding mistakes that could end a lineage. When the environment became sufficiently complex, learning from others began to hold greater survival value than each individual rediscovering everything from the beginning. An almost invisible shift began to appear, not in physical form, but in behavior, as individuals did not only remember terrain or water sources, but began to observe one another, to register each other's actions, and within brief moments of hunting or evasion, a primitive coordination emerged, where two individuals moved in different directions to drive prey into a narrow space, where one waited while the other forced prey from its hiding place. Egg nests were no longer entirely abandoned to chance, but were occasionally guarded, especially as the density of snakes and small mammals increased nearby, as though a new instinct were being tested, incomplete, yet sufficient to make a difference. When danger appeared, short sounds were produced, not complex, not abstract in meaning, yet enough to warn nearby individuals. The young no longer grew solely by reflex, but followed the movements of adults, learning where food could be found, how to avoid exposed spaces, how to wait, how to withdraw at the right moment, and with each observation, a portion of knowledge no longer needed to be rediscovered. These creatures remained small, swift, vulnerable before larger predators, yet the advantage had begun to shift from body to behavior, from the individual to temporary coordination, from reflex to memory. When a useful behavior no longer vanished with a single individual, but was repeated long enough to pass through a reproductive season, history began to turn, slowly yet irreversibly. Pressure from mammals made solitary strategies increasingly ineffective, forcing every advantage to be shared, maintained, reinforced across multiple coexisting individuals. An individual that could learn might live longer, avoid more dangers, exploit rare opportunities more effectively. A group that could learn together became something else. That group began to accumulate patterns of behavior, repeated responses, habits no longer random but forming a fragile kind of tradition. In that moment, life was no longer shaped solely by genes and bodily structure, but began to be shaped by what was observed, imitated, and retained. The result did not appear as a leap, but as a threshold just sufficient to reveal that something new had begun. Behavior could be transmitted across generations without immediate genetic change. Young individuals grew within environments already containing effective ways of acting, and each repetition reduced the risk of trial and error. The Troodontid lineage in this narrative crossed the boundary between individual adaptation and group adaptation, where life was no longer a solitary struggle but became a process of shared accumulation. From there, biological evolution opened another path, one in which the earliest seeds of culture appeared, thin, early, almost invisible, yet enough to alter the trajectory of the millions of years that followed. When a group had learned to learn together, the world before it was no longer merely a place to react to, but gradually became a place that could be anticipated. Between 50 and 45 million years ago, Earth had drifted far beyond the violent twilight of the Chicxulub impact, so far that the layers of ash that once smothered the sky survived only as fossil memory buried deep within stone, while on the surface, life had begun to thicken again like a slow-growing tapestry woven from leaves, roots, mud, vapour, the murmur of insects, the hidden flicker of small wings within the canopy, the faint touch of hooves upon damp ground. Dense forests, forest edges, rocky river banks, and the shifting patches of light beneath the leaves were no longer empty spaces where creatures merely fled from death. They had become living labyrinths, where soft mud held fresh footprints, moist sand preserved faint sliding traces, decaying leaves recorded the lightest brush of a body that had just passed through, and the air still carried the scent of creatures that had vanished from sight only moments before. In such a world, the hypothetical Troodontid lineage no longer endured merely by persistence, no longer survived day by day as a fragile remnant of a dinosaur past, but had entered a more stable, more adaptable state, enough to hunt opportunistically within an environment filled with signals yet rarely offering clear answers. Prey did not always stand in plain sight. At times it left only a depression in the mud, a faint sound within the brush, a ripple in the water, a lingering warmth at the edge of a nest. From here, perception was no longer a simple reaction to what was present, but the gathering of many small fragments of sensation, guiding the body toward choices more flexible, more precise, reaching slightly beyond the present. It was within these half-lit forests that the eye began to do something far greater than merely seeing prey. The Troodontid descendants in this speculative lineage carried a distinctive morphological inheritance: large eye sockets, an ability to observe in low light, a gaze capable of fastening onto the slightest motion when shadow trembled between leaves, when a blade of grass bent not from wind but from the passing of a low body. Forward-facing eyes meant that space was no longer a chaotic flat plane of trunks, stones, water, and darkness. It became a field of depth, with distance and proximity, with gaps wide enough to slip through, branches low enough to avoid, ledges steep enough for ambush. Good vision allowed them to see. Depth perception allowed them to estimate. A relatively large brain, with finer processing capacity and a theropod branch already situated near the plausible threshold of higher cognition, ensured that what was seen did not pass like meaningless light, but was retained, compared, connected, and transformed into behavioral judgment. From that moment, the eye was no longer merely a window opening onto the present. It became a slender bridge, linking what had just occurred to what remained hidden, linking what remained hidden to what might soon emerge. Yet the eye alone was still not enough. The true transformation lay in how the world began to be read from what was no longer fully present. Beneath low dust, small mammals moved close to the ground, leaving broken trails of footprints like blurred writing upon mud. In grasses along the forest edge, low-nesting birds left disturbed leaves, the scent of warmth, entry paths so brief they appeared only for moments before being swallowed by decay. Among roots and stone crevices, small reptiles vanished as swiftly as fragments of shadow cut from light, leaving behind only faint traces, soft rustling, fleeting motion caught at the edge of sight. Hidden young did not reveal themselves, yet the adult, through its caution, its repeated paths, the way it turned its head toward a particular patch of grass, could inadvertently betray where fragile life was concealed. Such prey forced the hunter beyond direct pursuit of what was visible, for the most important element had often already vanished, had yet to appear, or lay hidden behind a thin veil of leaves. To thrive, they had to assemble scattered signals into an incomplete image within the mind, as if the forest were no longer scenery, but a damp, shifting text, always half-written. From this point, hunting began to change its nature, no longer a single well-timed lunge, but a sequence of inferences slowly taking form. A Troodontid individual might pause before a stretched line of mud, not because prey stood ahead, but because the mud was still wetter than its surroundings, because the edges of the footprint had not yet collapsed, because grains of sand still clung in the direction of a small claw's drag. It distinguished fresh tracks from old, the silence of a cooled path from the taut silence of a creature that had only just departed. It saw a cluster of leaves brushed aside, noted the brighter underside newly exposed, and understood that a low body had passed through moments before. It heard a branch snap, not merely as sound, but as weight within sound, as rhythm short or long, discerning whether the hidden presence was a small, hurried body or something larger pressing through dry wood. At a shallow riverbank, It watched ripples spreading around stone, recognizing that something had just entered or left the water, for the surface did not lie. It held motion only for seconds before erasing it. Near a low nest, a lingering scent told of recent activity, not distant, not yesterday, but recent enough that the world still retained the warmth of a vanished presence. One individual might follow an adult mammal without striking, keeping to shadow, observing its path, waiting for hesitation, waiting for the moment it unknowingly traced, through its own caution, the hidden route to its young. In such moments, vision no longer reflected the present like a still pool reflecting the sky. It connected fragments what had happened, what was concealed, what might follow. In that connection, the world acquired sequence, signs acquired meaning, hunting acquired memory, comparison, and waiting. It was then that an almost invisible boundary emerged between reflex and prediction. When a creature no longer reacted solely to what stood before it, but directed its behavior toward what had not yet fully appeared, a new rung of cognition revealed itself, small, quiet, yet deep as a fissure opening into the future. Prediction became the next foundation of intelligence, for hunting was no longer governed only by muscle, speed, or chance. It became the first lesson in cause, sign, and consequence. From here, the hypothetical Troodontid lineage no longer existed within the environment merely as a body surrounded by trees, water, earth, and shadow. They began to construct within their minds an approximate version of what the environment would do next. Perhaps intelligence did not begin when a creature made tools. Perhaps it began earlier, more quietly, in the moment when a pair of eyes looked upon a trace in the mud and silently anticipated the world. Once a species had learned to infer from traces, the next step almost unfolded from its own movement. They would not only read the world, but begin to touch it, hold it, pull it, and use one thing to alter another. Between 45 and 40 million years ago, within that speculative lineage, the world was no longer a raw wasteland after catastrophe, nor yet a stage of clear intelligence, but a long quiet in between, where evolution worked through changes so small they were almost invisible. Along shallow river banks, within humid low forests and stony shores still cool after receding waters, soft mud preserved footprints, broken branches caught among roots, fallen logs leaned beneath shadow, insect nests hid beneath thin soil, shattered eggshells lay among small bones, and scattered objects carried and abandoned by flood, wind, and erosion, like fragments of a world slowly arranging itself. Here, opportunity no longer appeared only as prey crossing the line of sight, but lay behind coverings, beneath hard shells, within narrow crevices, inside rotting wood, where reaching food required more than seeing, more than waiting, more than guessing. After millions of years shaped by sharper vision, stronger spatial memory, and finer predictive ability, the hypothetical Troodontid lineage approached another nearly invisible boundary. They no longer merely recognized opportunity. They began to intervene in it. In such a world, the greatest difference no longer belonged to the one who saw movement first, but to the one who could touch the world with slightly greater precision at the right moment, for just long enough to shift events in its favor. The creatures at the center of this transition remained small, swift, living in flexible groups along forest edges and water margins, bearing no resemblance to primates, possessing neither human hands nor opposable thumbs, nor refined dexterity to twist, carve, or bind in any technical sense. Their bodies were still those of small theropod descendants, with forelimbs not instruments of abstract thought, yet not entirely helpless before objects, clawed hands, digits capable of gripping, hooking, pulling, pushing, bracing, curved talons able to cling to bark, rake into insect nests, hold small bones, seize dry branches or fix an object momentarily before jaws and snout completed the task. Within the evolutionary tree, Troodontid ancestors lay closer to the lineage leading to birds than many other theropods, and signs within this group's brain allow for a pathway not resembling the human one, not passing through primate hands, but still relying upon coordination between eye, brain, neck, snout, and forelimb to open a primitive form of manipulation. It was not enough for complex technique, but enough for a useful accident to repeat, enough for a second time, enough for a third. A major turning point in evolution does not always begin with invention, with idea, or with any moment of brilliance, but with an awkward gesture preserved because it happened, by chance, to work. Perhaps on a damp morning after rain, a young individual used a dry branch to prod the ground near an insect nest, not because it understood the branch as an extension of its body, but because the branch lay within reach, because its claw caught upon it, because a downward motion broke the thin soil and insects surged upward like a living darkness. The group rushed in, seizing the scattered small bodies, and within that chaotic motion, a faint association settled into memory branch. Nest, food. At another bank, an individual used a pebble to strike the hard shell of an egg or other food source, not understanding force or impact, not knowing physical principles in any complete sense, only that a crack sounded, a new scent escaped, an interior revealed itself, and the cold round object beneath its claw ceased to be merely stone, becoming instead a shorter path to nourishment. Within temporary shelters, some individuals dragged branches across entrances, sometimes to conceal young from sight, sometimes to retain warmth, sometimes merely because the branch had been pulled there during a struggle for food. Yet when such covering proved useful, when scent spread less, when the shadow of a predator passed without stopping, that gesture, too, gained a chance to persist. A small object held by forelimbs while jaws worked, a branch no longer merely a branch, a stone no longer merely a stone. Something once inert within the landscape began to serve as a temporary ally to the body. At first, everything remained unstable, clumsy, misaligned, almost accidental. Not every individual could do it. Not every attempt succeeded. Not every behavior endured. Yet within that imperfection, a new boundary emerged. For the first time in this story, the organism did not merely bend to its environment, did not merely run faster, see farther, remember longer, but began to alter the environment slightly according to immediate need. Very small, yet no longer the same. The science of animal behavior lends this speculation firmer ground, for object use need not appear as a flash from nothing, nor begin with complete technical awareness. It can arise where the body is capable of manipulation, where the environment offers materials, where individuals learn through trial and error, where a useful act is retained in memory, sometimes observed by others, imitated imperfectly, adjusted, repeated in slightly altered form. This hypothetical Troodontid lineage need not invent tools outright. It needed only to perform something useful. Remember that it had once been useful. Encounter a similar circumstance and repeat it, allowing another pair of eyes within the group to carry that fragment of behavior into another day. The most meaningful moment did not lie in the claw touching the branch, nor in the stone striking the shell. It lay afterward, within memory. From here, something very small yet very deep began to appear. Objects were no longer entirely external to the body, but were drawn into sequences of purposeful action, as if the outer world were being extended into the nervous system by invisible threads of experience. The climax of this transition was not a grand scene, not a structure, not a revolution, but the moment a creature connected three things once separate: memory, object, and purpose. It saw a branch, remembered the nest. It saw a stone, remembered the crack. It saw a hollow, remembered the blocking branch. From this chain, primitive tools emerged not as invention, but as repeated behavior. Objects in the environment acquired function, no longer neutral matter lying beneath the feet. Cognition entered a new loop, seeing objects, using objects, remembering objects, seeking them again when needed. This was not yet the dawn of technology in any radiant sense. It was only a thin light at the edge of the horizon of intentional manipulation. Yet sometimes, a thin line of light is enough to redirect the course of a long history. As objects began to take on function, the next evolutionary step would belong to something far more intangible, not branches or stones, but brief sounds within the low forest, the first signals linking one body to another. Around 40 to 35 million years ago, in a world that had begun to cool after the deep upheavals of its past, damp forests spread like a dense, living carpet, where light no longer reached the ground intact but fractured into scattered fragments through layers of leaves, where low trunks, tightening vines, and tangled undergrowth wove themselves into dark green walls, where every gap between tree bases opened only a narrow corridor of sight, stretching a few meters before dissolving again into a soft, heavy darkness, turning the world into a sequence of broken scenes, disjointed, never fully revealed in a single moment. In such an environment, sight was no longer a stable advantage but became a matter of chance, for danger rarely appeared from afar. It rose from beneath the leaf litter, from the edge of a nest, from behind a trunk, from a space that a blink earlier had been empty and safe, so that recognition by the eye arrived too late, when reaction had already become the final instinct between life and death. Within that very context, life in groups began to take on greater necessity, not for simple cohesion but for the sharing of perception. As each individual could see only a fragment of the world, while the group could assemble a broader picture, still incomplete, still interrupted by leaves, by trunks, by darkness, yet enough to stretch a few more precious moments before danger arrived. Competition thickened. Larger mammals moved through the lower layers. Predators learned to wait in silence, while nests of eggs and the unmoving, fragile young became the easiest targets, shifting the pressure of selection away from seeing far and toward reacting quickly. In a world where vision was constrained, what moved faster than sight began to be favoured: sound. When the forest no longer allowed all individuals to see the same thing at the same time, the group gradually learned to share what it knew through something that could pass through leaves, slip around trunks, and travel across darkness without needing the straight path of light. Within small groups of a more socialized Troodontid lineage, memory ceased to be a chain of isolated reflexes and began to accumulate. Observation was no longer only for hunting, but for reading the smallest shifts in the environment. Coordination was no longer coincidence but a tendency, and the first sounds appeared not as language but as raw markers, short, sharp, breaking out when something was not as it should be, a warning call rising and fading, a summoning sound pulling the young back, a sequence of low tones marking a space the group regarded as its own, all still scattered, still uncertain, yet already distinct from silence. Each sound began to carry with it a response, a slight tilt of the head, a flick of the tail, feathers lifting or pressing flat, a small crest trembling in the air. Visual signals at close range joining with sound to clarify what was being conveyed, for not all threats were the same, not all opportunities required the same reaction. Beneath the decaying leaves might lie a hidden snake. At the edge of an opening, a predator might be advancing along the ground. Above might circle birds competing for nesting space. And each danger, each opportunity, each circumstance demanded finer signalling, because a single sound was no longer enough to describe a world that had grown too complex. From this point, sound was no longer merely the expression of an inner state, but began to carry instruction for outward action. A short, sharp note burst out when the leaf layer stirred near the edge of a nest, causing the nearest individual to lower its body, retreat quickly, pulling the young into deeper cover before the shape of danger revealed itself. Another, deeper and more compressed sound spread in brief pulses when heavy movement came from the ground, leading the group not to contract inward, but to split along familiar paths, or withdraw toward a remembered point of safety. A more even, lighter sequence appeared when a source of food was exposed, drawing individuals toward the water's edge, to where insects had just emerged, to where a fresh carcass lay, where life continued through the death of another. At close range, sound did not stand alone. It moved with posture, with motion, with distance, making the difference between alarm, gathering, or maintaining space more distinct. The young at first responded by instinct alone, running at any sudden sound, freezing in surprise, but gradually, through repetition, through observation, through failures and survivals, they began to connect sound with outcome, sound with danger, sound with opportunity, understanding that some sounds demanded concealment, some demanded return, some led toward food, a network of associations forming not in a single moment, but across countless repeated moments within the forest's shadow. What deepened was not the sound itself, but the fact that response was no longer automatic. It became a choice. Troodontids did not merely produce signals, they began to evaluate them, to learn when to trust and when to ignore, to recognize that not all individuals were equally reliable, that some alarm calls consistently accompanied real danger, while others emerged at the wrong time, in the wrong context, and were gradually disregarded by the group, so that communication ceased to be a hollow chain of sounds and became part of social memory, where information attached itself to the one who produced it, to the context, to the consequence. The young no longer simply listened. They watched the reactions of older individuals, paused for a moment, observed a movement, then decided whether to flee, remain still, or retreat to the nest. a small silence appearing between signal and action. Within that silence, a boundary began to shift. A sound was no longer merely a sign of fear in the present, but began to stand for a danger that might not yet be visible, something existing beyond the caller, but brought into the awareness of others through sound, as if the external world were compressed into a brief signal and unfolded again within the minds of others. Not yet language, not yet structure, not yet syntax, yet already a system of signals carrying meaning beyond raw emotion. The result of this shift was quiet, gradual, yet spread across generations as groups that understood signals better hunted more effectively, escaped more in time, protected nests more successfully, raised their young more reliably, accumulating advantage not through strength, but through the ability to share what they knew. Memory from here was no longer merely a map of places or objects, but began to become a map of shared meaning between individuals. When a group could transmit not only fear but information, its existence was no longer a chain of disconnected reactions, but a continuous flow of shared memory, where each sound did not simply arise and fade, but left traces in how they lived together longer, remembered one another longer, and gradually formed something close to the memory of a community. Around 35 to 30 million years ago, along a branch of time where a small Troodontid lineage had passed through the long shadow after Chicxulub, their lives were no longer shaped solely by foraging paths, damp undergrowth, or silent evasions from predators, but began to revolve around something softer, warmer, more fragile than nest, at the edges of ancient forests, where low cliffs broke the monsoon winds, where large tree hollows held the night's warmth, where dry stone ledges lay not far from water and familiar foraging corridors. Many small groups began to return seasonally, not by chance, but because such places offered wide enough views to detect danger, hidden enough spaces to conceal eggs, and distances close enough for multiple bodies to coexist without crushing one another. They still laid eggs, as the distant inheritance of theropods and birds remained within them, but laying eggs was no longer a simple act abandoned to soil, leaf litter, and chance. Some brooding, warming, and protective traits, already present in older Maniraptoran relatives, were in this scenario extended, refined, and pressed under the harsh demands of a world where the young lay vulnerable among too many hungry mouths. Small mammals could slip in at dusk to steal eggs. Snakes could slide through damp roots. Large birds and opportunistic predators could descend when a nest stood empty for only moments. A lost egg hollowed out a season. A lost young erased a future memory before it could form. When the most fragile part of the group was no longer the adult individual hunting or fleeing, but the small bodies that needed warmth, shelter, and a timely warning before claws reached the nest's edge, social structure was forced to shift slowly, like stone worn by water over many seasons. More socialized Troodontids no longer placed nests too far apart within the forest, for a solitary nest was a point of silence, while many nests together became a system of multiplied eyes, ears, and responses. They began to choose nesting areas closer to one another, not crowded like a city, not ordered like a system with rules, but near enough that a sharp call could reach the next nest. An unusual movement could be noticed by many. A small attack could be met by multiple bodies moving to intercept. Some individuals remained in short watches, neck slightly raised, eyes scanning the rock edge and low brush. Others left to forage and returned with small prey, hard seeds, large insects, or soft pieces of flesh suitable for the young. Older individuals, slower, less daring, might no longer be the most skilled in pursuit, yet they carried within them a living archive of where snakes had been seen, which crevices flooded when the winds shifted with the season. The nest was no longer simply a place for eggs. It became the center of roles. It became the place where society began to take shape. From those seasonal returns, the young grew not only beneath the warmth of a single parent, but within a wider circle of adult bodies constantly shifting position around them. The first world they knew was not the entire planet, not distant plains, not forests stretching to the horizon, but the smell of damp leaves mixed with eggshell, the faint scrape of claws on stone, the silhouette of a sentry standing still at the exit, the short call that rose when something moved in the brush, the safe space behind a large root, the retreat path into a low crevice. They learned by watching. They learned that a low, rough sound might accompany a snake, while a rapid, sharp call rising from the throat signaled danger from above. They learned that not every individual returning to the nest carried food, not every approach invited them to open their mouths, not every contact was harmless, not every distance was safe. In many modern group-living species, the young learn from parents, siblings, and other adults, for inexperience makes observation cheaper than injury, faster than trial and error, gentler than death. Here, too, knowledge no longer resided only in soil, water, tracks, or paths. It began to reside within other bodies. When life-saving information came to dwell within other individuals, memory had to open into a new domain, more intricate than remembering water sources or the way back to the nest. A young individual had to recognize who was familiar, who was not, who often stood watch near the cliff edge, who pushed it away from small portions of food, who once shielded it when the shadow of a large bird passed overhead, whom to follow when the cluster of nests suddenly stirred. In group life, individual recognition was not an ornament of intelligence but a quiet instrument of survival, for the same action could carry different meanings depending on who performed it. The same call could be trusted or doubted depending on the throat that produced it. The same approach could signal care, competition, warning, or threat. The young stabilized society because they were too costly to neglect. Older individuals preserved an invisible map of seasons and shelters. Competitive individuals created distance. Hierarchy, tension, and unnamed small alliances. Gradually, each group was no longer a cluster of bodies meeting around food. It became a network of past encounters, of old frictions, of small favours, of threats once made and choices adjusted by memory. When memory of others became as important as memory of place, social intelligence truly began. From here, society was no longer merely many organisms standing near one another in a breeding season. It became a living structure woven from memory, from warmth around the nest, from silent watches, from young growing within care and competition at once. A young individual no longer needed only to know its parent. It needed to know who protected it, who took its food, who should be avoided, who had helped, who had threatened. When such knowledge became as essential as water, as shade, as the path away from claws, intelligence no longer solved only the problems of objects, distance, and motion, but began to solve the problem of relationships. From primitive loyalty to quiet competition, from care to hierarchy, from social distance to small alliances, a new depth emerged around the forest edge nests. They did not merely live together, they began to live within one another's memory, and when a group had learned to remember one another, to divide roles, to guard nests and maintain relationships, another door of intelligence opened slowly: the coordination of action, the reading of movement in others, the anticipation of a prey's path before the hunt had truly begun. Some 30 to 25 million years ago, in that speculative thread of history where a small lineage of dinosaurs endured the darkness after Chicxulub, the world beneath their feet was no longer the world of closed forest canopies it had once been. Across many regions, the climate grew drier. Forests that had once stretched unbroken began to thin, retreating into ribbons of trees along river valleys, into scattered low shrubs, into fractured edges of woodland, revealing between them wider, brighter, harder to hide open spaces. The ground opened. Wind travelled farther over short grass. The shadow of a predator could be seen earlier, traced across dozens of trunks before it ever came close enough to strike. In such mixed habitats, where forest, scrub, riverbank, and grassland lay side by side like fragments of a world reshaping itself, hunting could no longer rely on hiding in shade and bursting forth in a brief instant of surprise. Prey had more room to see, to veer, to run, and the hunter was forced to learn how to think before the body moved. As the distance between hunter and prey stretched, what mattered was no longer just speed in the final seconds, but the quiet choices laid down much earlier from where to stand, to the direction of the wind, to the distance to be held, to the point toward which the prey might panic and flee. It was within that widening space that this hypothetical Troodontid lineage began to cross a narrow threshold from opportunistic hunting to arranged pursuit. They remained light, fast, agile creatures, lacking the overwhelming mass of ancient giant predators, but within those smaller bodies, many faculties had been sharpened through millions of years of group living. Ice that could read motion from farther away, memory that retained the shape of riverbanks and stone clusters, body signals that carried brief warnings, and a social order stable enough that an individual did not always surge forward at the insistence of its own instinct. Their prey did not wait. These were small herbivorous mammals, swift-running birds, other light bodies that survived by reflex, by ear, by eye, by sudden changes of direction across open ground. To chase directly was to lose to distance. To rush blindly was to fall behind a sharp turn. But if several hunters appeared at once from different angles, if one revealed the direction of escape, another lay silent in low brush, a third blocked the path toward water or stone. Then the hunt ceased to be a straight line between two bodies. It became a shape. On a dry morning along the valley's edge, as light spread thin across the grass and moisture still lingered in shallow hollows near the river, a hunting group could move without perfect synchrony and yet remain bound to a single aim. One individual stepped out early enough to be seen, but not close enough to cause panic. Another lowered itself behind a line of shrubs, holding distance like a shadow swallowed by the earth. A third slipped quietly along a band of stone, where what seemed an open escape was in truth narrowed by terrain. The riverbank was no longer just water, it became a soft wall, The rock hollow was no longer merely shelter. It became a screen. The brush was no longer only vegetation. It became a cut in the prey's field of vision. From that moment, success no longer resided entirely in the final rush. It had begun minutes before, perhaps hours before, when the group chose positions, held rhythm, reduced sound, waited for the right direction of flight, the right degree of fear, the small mistake of a body struggling to survive. Each individual no longer did only what instinct compelled, but what aligned with the actions of the others. One had to restrain the urge to chase. Another had to wait when the moment seemed to have arrived. A third had to trust that a companion would appear where needed. At the precise instant the prey lost its best option. Intelligence here did not blaze like invention, did not manifest as tools, did not carve marks into stone or bone. It revealed itself in the slowing before action. The most subtle shift lay not in muscle nor in speed, but in the ability to construct a near future within the mind. If the prey glimpsed a shape at the edge of grass, where would it turn? If pressed toward water, how would it angle away? If stone carried an unfamiliar scent or motion, would it risk the brush or retreat to open ground? In such a hunt, this hypothetical Troodontid lineage no longer responded only to where the prey stood, but began to track where it might be. The brain did not merely register the present, it rehearsed possibilities, discarded weaker paths, and placed the body where the next moment could unfold. This was the point at which hunting ceased to be a simple chase. It became a structure of thought, not to run faster, but to understand sooner, not to be stronger, but to be positioned with precision, not to rush into the world as a reflex, but to quietly arrange the world so that the prey's own reflex would draw it toward failure. Groups that coordinated more effectively fed more. Groups that used riverbanks, low brush, stone, and open ground as parts of a single trap gained a greater advantage. From here, the intelligence of this hypothetical Troodontid lineage became more visible than ever, not only in memory, not only in signals, not only in group life, but in the capacity of multiple bodies to construct an outcome that had not yet occurred and then, quietly, make it real. And when a species has learned to divide roles, to hold rhythm, and to turn prediction into strategy, the next threshold may no longer lie in prey at all, but in a force of nature deeper, more dangerous, more difficult to command fire. Some 25 to 20 million years ago in this speculative history, as seasonally dry grasslands spread under prolonged cycles of drought, as thinning forests were torn open by lightning, as the edges of volcanic regions still held heat within the soil and thin veils of ash upon stone, fire was present as a force older than any creature's memory. It required no intention, no master, no hand to summon it. A bolt of lightning struck dry grass. A tree split open in a storm. Flames crept through layers of fallen leaves, and within hours, a landscape once dense could become an expanse of blackened ground, where smoke clung to the air, where warmth lingered beneath ash, where small prey lost their cover, where carcasses, insects, cracked seeds, and scattered fragments of food lay exposed as the quiet aftermath of catastrophe. In such a world, fire did not only take, it revealed. After stripping away the old cover, it left behind a surface more open, more legible, and for a brief span, more abundant in opportunity. It was along such smouldering edges that these hypothetical Troodontid groups may have accumulated enough conditions not to flee by instinct alone. They were not creatures that invented fire, not hidden masters of flame, and certainly not some lost historical proof buried in stone. They were simply a social lineage shaped by millions of years of selection, possessing memory refined enough to recognize places that once yielded food after burning, signals clear enough to mark safe distance, social stability sufficient to prevent the group from collapsing into chaos, and rudimentary interactions with objects that made it conceivable, within a narrow margin, to drag a smouldering branch, to cover embers, or to keep distance from heat. If a species is curious enough, remembers enough, and knows how to pause before fear, its first path is not control of fire. Its first path is learning not to vanish the moment fire has passed. That change did not begin within the blaze itself. It began afterward when smoke had thinned, when ash still held warmth, when the forest had fallen silent and everything seemed to stand clearer beneath a muted grey. At first, they kept their distance. Fire was motion too fast, light too bright, heat too near, scent too alien, a force that roared, devoured vegetation, and turned shelter into a wide field of death. But after many dry seasons, many burns, many late returns, some groups began to perceive a different rhythm in the aftermath. There were bodies that had not escaped. There were insects drawn from charred cover. There were seeds cracked by heat, plant tissue softened, the scent of food altered. The ground opened to traces easier to follow than before. Fire did not become a companion, it remained a danger. Yet at the margin of that danger, a slow lesson formed that what is most feared in a landscape may also be what renders it more readable. The most delicate boundary did not lie in returning to burned ground. Many creatures in nature revisit such places to exploit newly exposed resources or altered environments. The harder boundary lay in remaining a little closer, a little longer close enough to feel heat, far enough not to burn, aware enough to recognize that distance need not always mean retreat. For that to occur, even in speculation, a species must carry multiple layers of ability at once. It must remember that embers can remain hot after flames fade. It must anticipate that contact brings injury. It must restrain the urge to flee when a red glow flickers within a hollow or depression in the ground. It must coordinate with others around a dangerous object without crowding, without panic, without turning curiosity into death. Thus, at the furthest cautious reach of this narrative, some hypothetical Troodontid groups may have begun to maintain a safe proximity to embers or natural heat sources for short periods, not as invention, but as momentary use. There is no evidence that non-avian dinosaurs ever controlled fire. Even within the history of early human lineages, the story of fire use and control is complex, late, and resistant to simple telling. And so, here, one may only say if a lineage possessed the necessary conditions if memory, society, curiosity, and the restraint of fear converged at the right moment, then naturally occurring heat might have become a new boundary against which cognition was tested. If such a moment ever occurred, brief, crude, fragile, it would not resemble triumph. It would resemble stillness. A creature standing before a lingering red glow in ash, not fleeing at once. It watches. It waits. It steps back when heat draws too near, steps forward when warmth softens, returns when darkness settles along the forest's edge. Within that small movement, intelligence ceases to be only the knowledge of where prey lies, which track leads to water, which signal calls the group home. It becomes the ability to stand before something that can both destroy and transform, and to learn from that tension. Night does not vanish, but it shortens in the life of the group. Food does not change in essence, but the way it is approached begins to shift. Small bodies linger longer around a warm patch, around a faint natural light, around a glow that does not belong to them and yet begins to draw them closer together. This is not yet civilization. This is not mastery over nature. It is only a world, for the first time, gathered around a point of light. And when a species can look into fire and see more than fear, the next question is no longer only what it can do with its environment, but what it must pay, should its intelligence continue to grow. Somewhere between 20 and 15 million years ago, in this imagined thread of history, across stretches of land worn familiar through many returning seasons, near slow rivers, shallow lakes, sparse woodlands, and low rock shelters deep enough to break the wind yet not so deep as to swallow the light. The descendants of those once small Troodontid branches were no longer solitary shadows slipping through the remnants of an older world. They had begun to return to the same places, to recognize the same paths, to remember where water endured when the dry season lingered too long, to keep their distance from dangerous ground, to distinguish the signals of the familiar from those of the unknown, to learn by watching, by waiting, by repeating the movements that once led to food or safety. And yet, precisely as group life grew steadier, as social memory deepened, as each young individual was no longer born merely to run, to bite, to survive by instinct alone, something heavier began to grow within their skulls, a brain that demanded more energy to form, more time to mature, a young body that required longer care before it could step into a world of teeth, claws, drought, and shadow. From this point onward, intelligence was no simple gift. It became a debt the body must first bear, then the family, and in the end, the entire group together. In the generations that followed, the change did not arrive as a sudden miracle, but as a slow, bending curve of evolution, drawn across countless breeding seasons, countless failures, countless young that never reached maturity. Their brains grew larger relative to those imagined ancestors before them, not in a way that instantly raised them above all others, but in a quieter manner, allowing longer memory, finer distinctions of signal, clearer learning from the actions of others. Childhood stretched longer, for a young body carrying a growing brain could no longer rely on reflex alone. It needed to observe how adults found food, how they avoided the scent-marked zones of predators, how they recognized warning calls, how they held their place within the group without being pushed to the edge of safety. The family group, in turn, endured more firmly, not from kindness in any human sense, but because those that forced their young into independence too soon lost them in greater numbers, while those stable enough to sustain them longer left behind more descendants. A larger brain could learn more, yet it hungered more, grew slower, remained fragile for longer. The question was no longer which individual was more clever, It became which group was stable enough to raise intelligence to life. From that pressure, daily existence began to shift in small ways with long consequences. Adults did not simply leave shelter to hunt and eat where they stood. They returned, carrying fragments of meat, broken eggs, small carcasses, or whatever could still be shared with the weaker members, especially the young not yet swift enough to fend for themselves. When the dry season stretched on, when riverbanks shrank into cracked ribbons of mud, when herds moved farther and fruit grew scarce, those groups that maintained a steady rhythm of sharing endured more surely than those bound only by internal competition. Within such groups, roles began to emerge like faint lines revealed on stone. After rain, some individuals were more adept at foraging. Others kept watch longer. Some remembered the paths back to water. Others remained near the nesting ground, tending the young and holding a quiet stability around the place of refuge. No individual was born with a fixed title, yet through repetition, through memory, through success and failure, useful behaviours remained, while those that disrupted stability were repaid with loss. The young became the pressure that tightened society. Adults could no longer optimize for their own hunger alone. They had to optimize for the cycle of the group, for this season and the next, for the small mouths of today and the hunters of years to come. Intelligence had begun to require a shelter of society. Gradually, in those groups that endured long enough to remember more than a single season, a new form of wealth appeared, not in claw or tooth, not in the flesh of a hunt just ended, but within the aging individuals who had slowed, yet were not without value. They were no longer the swiftest across open woodland, no longer the first to strike, yet they remembered the paths to water that still held moisture when the sky withheld rain, remembered the places where the young once vanished beneath the shadow of larger predators, remembered lands marked by strange scents where food weakened the body, remembered the cycles by which prey returned after long absences. Experience ceased to be a private residue within an aging brain. It became a quiet form of insurance for the group, a living archive sparing the young from paying the same price for the same mistake. Each remembered path, each avoided danger, each dry season endured did not save a single life alone, but preserved the possibility of continued learning for those not yet grown. Intelligence no longer rested within separate skulls. It began to disperse across relationships. And here, the deeper layer of intelligence revealed itself. It did not grow with power, but with responsibility. A larger brain was not free. It was an energy debt no single individual could fully repay, for to bring a more intelligent young into survival required food, time, patience, watchers, caregivers, skilled hunters, path rememberers, elders valuable enough to be kept within the circle of shared life. Families expanded, social roles sharpened. Experience became an unseen asset, sometimes more valuable than muscle. For muscle might bring down prey in an afternoon, but memory could guide an entire group through a season of drought. From this point on, intelligence was no longer merely the advantage of a brighter individual. It became a structure that must be sustained, supported, and passed on, a slow-burning flame requiring many bodies to shield it from the long winds of evolution. And when a group had grown stable enough to raise intelligence to maturity, the next transformation no longer lay solely within flesh or blood, but within those things not written directly into genes' habits, skills, and ways of living began to persist as culture. Between roughly 15 and 10 million years ago in this imagined history, Troodontid populations no longer lived as a single line spread across a uniform world, for the earth beneath them had unfolded into many distinct landscapes, each like a question life was compelled to answer with body, memory, and habit. Along the coasts, where tides rose and fell like the ancient breath of the ocean, food did not always present itself, but revealed itself only in brief intervals between wet mud, slick stone, and hardened shells. In the mountain forests, life hid more deeply, within rotting wood, beneath damp layers of leaves, in the faint movements of insects and larvae. Across river plains, open space forced them to read the land from afar, to coordinate longer, to move as many parts of a single intention. Within rocky corridors and shallow caves, life tied itself to warmth, to shelter, to objects retained and places returned to across seasons. The same species, yet no longer the same world. The same ancestry, yet no longer the same way of living. From this point, intelligence did not rise like a single trunk reaching upward, but began to branch, extending in many directions, much like the lands that had divided these populations into distinct forms of life. These imagined Troodontid groups had now grown stable enough to preserve local habits across generations. For their group, life endured more firmly. Learning through observation had become more constant, and memory of individuals, places, and seasons had deepened enough that an effective way of living did not vanish with the death of one body. A young individual no longer needed to discover everything anew. It could watch an experienced elder turn a shell, follow a remembered path, avoid a dangerous crevice, wait for the moment when the tide receded or when insects gathered beneath damp wood. What passed between them was not speech in any human sense, nor law, but the trace of action. A sequence of movements imitated, experience repeated until it became ordinary within the group. The environment selected those who survived, but social learning preserved the ways that had once worked. Slowly, each region began to take on its own rhythm, as though one species spoke many dialects through behavior. Along the coast, some groups learned to use stones to crack or separate hardened shells along the tidal flats, not through a sudden invention, but through thousands of trials, failures, observations, and repetitions, until a small technique became a shared habit. They remembered when the water withdrew, when food was revealed, when the rocks became less treacherous. In the forests, other groups grew more attuned to the dimness beneath the canopy, using twigs, short sticks, claws, and beaks to probe for insects, larvae, or hidden eggs within wooden crevices, reading the fragile signals of the leaf litter as though tracing a nearly invisible map. In mountainous and rocky terrain, groups sheltered within shallow caves through colder periods, retaining useful objects, returning to the same safe points, until the landscape itself was no longer merely traversed, but remembered. Across river plains, where openness allowed prey to escape more easily, other groups developed coordinated hunting. One driving, another blocking, a small cluster lying in wait along the brush, turning the terrain itself into part of the strategy. The differences did not arise from place alone. They arose from ways of living that endured. From here, evolution no longer resided solely in bone, in claw, in eye, or even in the structure of the brain. A part of it began to live within habit. Culture, at its deepest and most primitive layer in animal life, required no writing, no art, no symbols raised upon stone. It required only a behaviour learned, passed from one individual to another, from one generation to the next, until it created stable differences between groups of the same species. When this threshold was crossed, the future of a creature was no longer stored only within its genes, as a silent instruction hidden in the body, but also beyond the body, in the way a young one watched an elder, in the path walked again and again, in the object lifted in a certain way, in the moment remembered, in a small habit that outlived the first being that formed it. And that was the moment when the history of a species ceased to be a single melody. Two groups of the same species could feed differently, hunt differently, shelter differently, transmit experience differently, even produce slightly different patterns of signals when warning, gathering, or keeping distance. From the outside, they remain the same branch of life, the same current of evolution stretching from the darkness after a distant catastrophe. Yet within the fabric of daily life, they had begun to carry distinct identities, local memories, small traditions like streams diverging from a single river. The Earth no longer offered a single path toward intelligence. It offered many paths, many rhythms, many experiments of a branching mind. And once a species had learned to preserve its own traditions, the next step was no longer merely to repeat what had been done before, but to begin shaping the very objects before it according to forms that had quietly taken shape within the mind. Between roughly 10 and 7 million years ago in this speculative history, as those Troodontid groups had already travelled a long road from mere survival through memory, observation, imitation, and the use of crude objects from their surroundings, the world around them began to open into a new layer of possibility, not in the shadowed forests, nor along the familiar paths of the hunt, but in places where matter revealed itself in the greatest variety of forms, riverbanks strewn with pebbles after the waters receded, the edges of mountain caves where broken fragments lay scattered beneath the cliff, patches of damp clay that could hold an imprint, preserve a shape, dry, crack, and transform under sun and wind. There, materials were no longer so scarce that anything found by chance had to suffice. There was enough, there was variation, there was repetition, and so selection began to matter. A heavier stone, a sharper edge, a harder bone, a clump of earth that held together more firmly. To use what was given had once been a great step, but to make it more fitting marked another boundary, deeper and quieter, for it required not only a body touching matter, but a mind holding onto a goal while the act itself was still unfolding. From this point, the change no longer lay only in the feet, the eyes, or the signals of the group, but in the way a creature could look at a stone and sense within it a form that had not yet appeared. At this stage, those Troodontid groups were no longer beings that merely reacted to the world as it was, for across millions of years of memory, imitation, and trial, they had accumulated a deeply practical understanding of materials, not through language, not through abstract thought, but through impact, failure, the smell of blood, the lines of fracture, the scatter of fragments, the dry sound of stone striking stone. they began to distinguish which pieces were too brittle and shattered, which were hard enough to strike with force, which bore natural edges suited for cutting skin, which when struck together could release a sharper fragment than what had existed before. To do so, the mind could no longer remain confined to the immediate moment. It had to hold a faint template, an unfinished shape, a desired result not yet grasped in the claw, and adjust each movement in response to what emerged. If the first strike failed, the force had to change. If the edge broke away unevenly, the angle of grip had to shift. If a fragment proved better than the original, it had to be kept. Within these small sequences, memory worked. Control of action took form, and the ability to track outcomes began to converge, like small streams gathering into a single riverbed, until from mere survival responses there emerged a form of organized intention. An object was no longer chosen simply because it happened to be there. It was kept because it was more suitable, and then altered because it was still not good enough. At first, these changes may have been so slight as to almost escape notice. Hardly deserving the name of manufacture to a hurried eye, one individual did not take the nearest stone, but stepped further to choose a heavier one. Another did not discard a sharp fragment after use, but carried it back toward a shelter. A group along the riverbank began to favour stones with natural edges over those worn smooth. Younger individuals stood near those more adept, watching them turn an object in their forelimbs, press it down with body weight, then strike, pull, turn, and try again. From such choices, a new step slowly emerged. Two stones were struck together not merely to make sound or to break something in front of them, but to produce a new edge. A point of contact was thinned because a thinner edge cut more cleanly. An object was kept not because it appeared finer, but because it worked better. These actions likely did not arise everywhere at once, nor did they stabilize immediately. For in one valley they might vanish with the death of a few skillful individuals, while along another river bank they were seen, imitated, done poorly, corrected, and repeated long enough to become a habit of the group. From the outside, it was only broken stone. From within evolution, it was action layered upon action, small sequences nested within a greater aim, the present moment serving a result not yet arrived. Yet the most important moment did not lie in the sound of stone striking stone, nor in the edge just formed, nor in the first scratch across a prey's skin. It lay in a far quieter gesture the object was kept. When a simple tool was made and then carried away from the place of its making, across the edge of a riverbank, over damp ground, into the darkness of a cave, across the span between a present need and one not yet arisen, that object stepped beyond the logic of immediate reaction. It was no longer bound to the moment that gave birth to it, but became part of a plan, however rudimentary, however vague, still residing more in the body than in any clear thought. A skillful individual could become a silent centre of learning, not by command, but because its actions left results clear enough for others to observe. The young and the inexperienced dropped stones, struck at wrong angles, kept fragments too dull, and gradually learned that not all materials were alike, not all strikes were the same, not all results were worth keeping. In places where materials were abundant, the difference between groups that could modify objects and those that only gathered them began to widen, not with the noise of a hunt, but with the persistence of water wearing down stone. An object carried for later use was an object that had already moved ahead of its own moment. At that instant, the external world began to bear the trace of something unfamiliar, an intention not already embedded in nature. When a creature shapes a form that nature has not given it, to serve a purpose held only in its mind, matter ceases to be merely the backdrop of life, and becomes a surface upon which intention leaves its mark. Manufactured tools emerged, still small, still slow, not yet enough to be called industry in any broad sense, yet sufficient to alter the pace of feeding, the way flesh was opened, the protection of nests, the handling of bone, stone, clay, and the more stubborn materials of the environment. This remains a line of speculative evolution, yet it stands upon firm ground when multi-step manipulation, a target template, working memory, control of action, and social learning converge. A new level of cognition has formed. From this point, that hypothetical Troodontid lineage no longer merely used the environment. It began at the level of objects to edit it. And once objects begin to carry the shape of intention, the next question no longer circles only around tools or techniques, but opens into a wider horizon. If an intelligent species that is not human were to build a society of its own, what would that society become? Between roughly 7 and 5 million years ago in this speculative timeline, the small descendants of theropods no longer moved through the world as temporary hunting groups that appeared and dissolved with the seasons. They began instead to anchor their lives to places returned to again and again, near water sources, near the mouths of shallow caves, beneath wind-sheltered cliffs, along corridors of nests imprinted across generations. These places were not villages in the human sense, not houses, not plazas, not centres of a society built by primate hands, but a network of nests, paths, vantage points, foraging grounds, shelters, and familiar stretches of land remembered by the body before the mind ever named them. They remain descendants of dinosaurs, without human hands to grasp, turn and craft as we do, without the soft, expressive faces of primates, not giving birth to live young as mammals do, but still bound to eggs, to breeding seasons, to guarded nests, to signals carried in sound, in the tension of the neck, in the tilt of the head, in the movement of the tail, in the colour of feathers, in posture, in the entire body as a silent yet precise language. For this reason, their society could not be a human society draped over a different form. It had to grow from their own bones, muscles, eyes, nests, and seasons. If intelligence arose here, it would not turn them into humans beneath an ancient skin. It would make them more themselves, deeper, denser, more stable, more organised. Clusters of nests could become centres of life, not as separate dwellings, but as shared breeding zones where distances between nests were close enough for warnings to spread quickly, yet far enough to reduce direct conflict. Hierarchy within a group need not rest upon brute strength alone, but could gradually revolve around age, memory of territory, navigation ability, hunting skill, steadiness in guarding the young, and above all, the reliability of an individual when it signalled danger or led others toward water. An older individual might not be the fastest, yet it remembered more seasons of drought. A smaller one might not dominate, yet it detected predators earlier. An individual need not rule through violence to become central. If others learned that when it called, one should retreat, when it stopped, one should watch. when it turned, one should follow. Their communication, therefore, did not require human-like speech to possess structure, for brief sounds, a tensed neck, a lowered tail, a change in crest colour with season or state could convey relation, warning, attraction, threat, and social acknowledgement. A community could be highly complex and yet entirely unfamiliar. Such a life would revolve around nests, seasons, and place more than around notions of personal ownership as humans often conceive it. When the breeding season returned, groups that had scattered might gather again along the same cliff corridor, the same riverbank, the same cluster of shallow caves, as if the memory of the community were inscribed not upon stone, but within the repeated paths of their feet. Alliances would form not only through blood, but through shared advantage across time, hunting together in a stretch of forest, protecting a nesting zone, maintaining access to water in the dry season, following safe routes when prey shifted. Competition would not always erupt into open conflict, for in a species bound to nests and seasons, power might lie in better nesting positions, in entrances less accessible to snakes, in areas nearer to stored food, in the ability to influence the group's direction as seasons changed. Gradually, paths used again and again, places where useful objects were left, piles of bone and discarded shells, watchful outcrops, open spaces where signals carried more clearly, all would combine into a social map without walls. Space became memory. Memory became structure. Comparison with birds offers some sense of the role of nests, breeding cycles, ritual, sound, and nesting sites. For there exists a rhythm of life not rooted in a house, but in return, in the persistence of place, in signals recognized through posture and call. Comparison with primates reveals another aspect, where alliances, social competition, observational learning, memory of individuals, and the roles they play can create a denser layer of awareness beyond isolated instinct. Yet such comparisons are only handholds. They are not molds, for the body is different, the way it touches objects is different, the way it perceives space is different, the reproductive cycle is different, the foundation of social sensation is different, and so the society that grows from them must also differ. Social intelligence is not a single garment worn the same way by every species. It is more like water moving across the unique terrain of each body, each environment, each evolutionary history. And thus, when it flows through a small theropod descendant, it will carve curves unlike those of humanity. At that point, a familiar assumption must fall away. An intelligent society need not begin with two human hands gathered around a fire. It may begin with nests that endure across seasons, with paths that are not forgotten, with stones kept in the right places, with sounds repeated for the right danger, with collective memory of where safety lies, where water once flowed, where eggs were lost, where shadows at dusk along a cliff should be avoided. From this, a form of non-human society takes shape, familiar enough to recognize coordination, hierarchy, alliance, and tradition, yet strange enough to resist being forced into a human frame. That hypothetical Troodontid lineage enters a new condition, where intelligence no longer resides solely within the skull of each individual, but extends across nests, seasons, paths, signals, and places returned to again and again. And once such a society has formed its own structure, the question is no longer only how they live together, but what a place remembered across generations will slowly become. Some 5 to 3 million years ago in this imagined timeline, certain places on Earth began to exert a quiet pull, not because they had been built, nor because they were sacred from the beginning, but because they gathered, almost by accident, too many of the conditions life needed to return. In great river valleys where water did not vanish too quickly after the dry season, along coastal plains where food came back with the rhythm of tides, breeding cycles and migrations, within broad caverns where shadow held a steadier microclimate than the open air, stone, bone, dry wood, hardened shells, and other durable materials began to appear in quantities no longer governed by chance alone. Across long cycles of climate, some regions grew harsher, others more erratic, yet a few remained stable enough to become meeting points of instinct, memory, and opportunity. At first, such a place was not a city. It was only a gathering point good enough to return to the next season. And the one after, until other groups too began to recognize the same pattern. The more intelligent Troodontid groups, already possessing rudimentary tools, more stable social signals, clearer local customs, and seasonal gathering grounds, began to tie their lives to these locations in ways deeper than passing stops. At first, they came for food. Then they came for water. Later still, they returned because the place had once been safe, had carried their young through a dangerous season, had shielded them from cold winds, larger predators, or sudden floods. Older individuals, bearing the accumulated memory of many seasons, became living maps, guiding their groups back along the same paths, into the same valleys, toward the same stretches of stone once used for watching. Skilled hunters and efficient foragers allowed larger clusters to endure longer in one region, while the presence of offspring demanded that nesting areas become more stable, more enclosed, harder to breach. When a place was recognized not only by the scent of soil, the shape of rock walls, or the sound of flowing water, but by the familiarity of other individuals, of known paths, of remembered positions, space itself began to thicken into society. From a seasonal gathering point, the place slowly acquired structure, not through plans or deliberate construction, but through the repetition of thousands of small acts. Large nesting areas separated from zones of food processing as blood, bone fragments, and the scent of flesh could draw danger too close to the young. Elsewhere, objects of use began to accumulate, stones that fit the hand, fragments of hard bone, lengths of wood that could be pulled, pried, struck, or used for shelter. On higher ledges overlooking plains or water, a watch area emerged from the habit of standing long in the same place. Between nests, water sources, and foraging grounds, familiar paths were worn down by countless steps. The soil pressed tighter, the grass thinned, the mud dried into faint lines like veins running through the body of the community. At a farther edge, bones, shells, broken materials, and the remnants of use gathered over time, no longer scattered like the refuse of a day, but layered across many seasons. Certain nesting positions came to be favoured, closer to the centre, better shielded from wind, harder to access, reflecting role, strength, age, or familiarity within each group. Place began to carry material memory. What mattered here was not walls, roofs, or squares. What mattered was that the place began to have a centre, an edge, pathways, zones of retention, zones of discard, and from those differences, a distinct form in the animal world, returning to the same location, reusing nesting grounds, and maintaining fidelity to a living range can produce stable spatial structures, offering reproductive advantages, clarifying the distinction between core and periphery, and leaving traces of use over time. When that logic is extended further in a speculative line of evolution, within a species endowed with strong spatial memory, more durable social bonds, habits of material retention, and the ability to return across many seasons, a form of biological settlement becomes plausible even before architecture emerges in the human sense. It is not yet a human city. It is a social spatial structure thickened by return, by partition, by accumulation, and by familiarity. When a place begins to hold not only the footprints of bodies that once passed through it, but also the habits, hierarchies, materials, and repeated choices of many generations, it crosses a new threshold. It is no longer merely shelter. It becomes memory compressed into soil, arranged within selected stone, left behind in dry bone, traced softly into pathways, preserved in nesting grounds returned to year after year. The first settlement appears in this way, not tall, not bright, without walls, without roofs, without squares to declare the presence of a civilization, yet with a living centre, with habitual roots, with retained materials, with margins of discard, with a collective memory embedded in the very shape of the land. It is the precursor of a non-human biological city, a city that does not yet call itself a city, but has already begun to do what all cities that follow will do, hold many lives within the same place. When a species becomes capable of turning place into material memory, the story no longer belongs only to a valley, a riverbank, or a wide cavern. It begins to unfold across the scale of the entire planet. Between 3 and 1 million years ago, in this imagined history, Earth entered a strange threshold, no longer merely a world where one species was slightly more intelligent than the rest, but gradually a planet whose surface began to be overlaid by the memory, habit, and repeated behavior of a single kind, across many continents, from temperate regions stretched beneath colder skies, to great river basins where sediment reshaped banks with each season, from humid, salt-edged coastal plains to low plateaus where water appeared and vanished with cycles of drought and rain. Small traces of organization began to connect. In real history, before this period, early hominins had already existed, and the genus Homo left evidence around 2.75 to 2.80 million years ago, as a branch of primates slowly entering the long story that would lead to modern humans. But here, in this divergent branch of biology, primates still lived, still climbed, still foraged, still adapted within their forests and grassland margins, only they did not become the centre of the planet. Humans might never emerge, or if they did, they would remain a minor branch at the edge, a faint possibility within the vast shadow of another intelligence that had come earlier, longer, deeper. From that point on, the question was no longer how intelligent a species could become, but something far larger if intelligence did not follow the path of primates. By what shape would it rewrite the planet? By then, Troodontid descendant populations were no longer small groups returning only to a few familiar places for shelter or food. Through millions of years of accumulation, They had developed more stable societies, more refined rudimentary tools, deeper collective memory, and a capacity to influence their environment at regional scale, not through monumental structures, but through pathways, fire, gathering points, breeding cycles, resting grounds, hunting zones, and places of return. They expanded beyond old settlements, following rivers like the long arteries of continents, tracing coastlines where food drifted in, where mud held tracks, where tides left predictable boundaries, then moving through transition zones between forest and grassland, where prey moved in numbers, where sightlines opened but enough cover remained for concealment. Places once visited only by season became links within a larger network, rest points connected to water, water to breeding grounds to foraging regions, all preserved not by maps, but by memory carried in the bodies of the old and extended further by the young. The landscape was no longer something they passed through. It began to take on the shape of their habits. When a species becomes skilled enough to return to the same places, connect them through trails, keep fire through dry seasons, remember water across years, and repeat useful behaviors across generations, it ceases to be merely an inhabitant of its environment. It becomes a force that alters it. From the role of an intelligent predator, they moved into something broader, quieter, yet heavier within the ecosystem. In certain regions, fire was maintained or spread seasonally, not as absolute power, but as a dangerous practice learned, tested, constrained, repeated in dry grasslands, low shrubs, and forest edges prone to burning. Fixed paths emerge through countless feet, claws, and bodies, pressing down saplings, opening roots through dense growth, forcing prey to alter their movements, compelling competitors either to avoid or follow. Communal nesting clusters, maintained across seasons, altered the soil around them, accumulating food remains, waste, shells, bones, and ash into small patches distinct within landscapes once shaped mainly by climate, water, geology, and vegetation. Their predatory pressure, too, no longer resembled that of a solitary hunter, for a species that remembers, coordinates, returns, and anticipates the paths of its prey forces that pray to live differently. Many animal species can transform environments through repeated behavior, from digging, nesting, and trail making to altering water flow or habitat structure. When fire enters the cycle of a species' life, it can reshape vegetation, resources, and the patchwork of the land itself. Here, intelligent Troodontids were not gods of Earth. They were simply a species capable of remembering enough to repeat, repeating enough to create pressure, and creating enough pressure to compel other species to reorganize their lives around them. At that moment, the deepest change did not reside within the bodies of these intelligent dinosaurs, but spread outward into small mammals, flocks of birds, reptiles lying low in the grass, prey forced to learn how to live beneath a sky that now carried memory. In grasslands touched by seasonal fire, plants no longer returned along the same rhythm. Some places opened, others fragmented. Some offered longer sightlines, but fewer places to hide, shifting the paths of prey like water diverted by stones set into a river. Some species might not need to evolve physically at once, but their behavior would be driven swiftly into new branches feeding at different times, moving along altered routes, avoiding the scent of ash, avoiding trails, avoiding open spaces where coordinated hunters could more easily see them. A predator does not merely kill, It creates a geometry of fear across space. It turns one valley into danger, another riverbank into a place only approached at dusk, an open plain into a question every prey must answer with its feet, its ears, its sense of smell, with its very survival. Birds, mammals, reptiles, and competing species no longer lived within a completely unclaimed wilderness, but within a world beginning to bear the imprint of a non-human intelligence, an intelligence that did not build cities in the modern sense, yet was sufficient to fold habit into the shape of nature itself. It is here that the story reaches a quiet and austere realization. Cold as light falling across ancient stone, the planet does not need to wait for humans to be marked by intelligence. Earth does not wait for humans. It requires only a species capable of turning memory into a tool into habit, habit into repeated pressure upon rivers, grasslands, low forests, coastlines, and the migratory paths of countless other organisms. From this point forward, the planet enters the era of another intelligence, not a reflection of humanity, not a shadow of primates, but a distinct evolutionary possibility, born of claws, sharp vision, long memory, and communities that return to the places they once lived. The old question recedes. It is no longer whether they are intelligent. The larger question is what a world shaped by them would become when humans are no longer the inevitable destination, but merely one of many doors in history that might never have opened. And when the entire planet has begun to bear the traces of another intelligence, the next question becomes almost unavoidable if a civilization of such a species was to truly emerge. What form would it take beneath a sky that does not belong to us? From roughly 1 million years before this Magian present to now, along river banks where fresh silt settles after each flood season, across shell-strewn shores and pebble beaches, on high plateaus that grow colder at night, within widening cave mouths at the feet of mountains, or in valleys where water returns in steady cycles, the intelligent Troodontid populations no longer gather and disperse like seasonal herds. They return, they remember, they leave traces, and then come back to those traces, as if the landscape is no longer merely a place to inhabit, but a layer of memory lying outside the body. Across countless generations, the memory of places, tools, fire, social roles, and local customs accumulate slowly, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river, thin layer upon thin layer, almost invisible, until the accumulation itself becomes an order more enduring than any single instinct. From here, what must first be set aside is not a detail, but an entire habit of imagination, the habit of assuming that every civilization must rise in the likeness of the human hand, the human wall, and the human script. These communities, though they have crossed into the threshold of a non-human civilization, do not escape the bodies that gave rise to them. They remain descendants of small, light, swift theropods, bearing forelimbs unlike human hands, not shaped to hold pens or stack bricks along straight lines, but to grip, hook, pull, press, and hold materials through the force of claws, neck, body, and coordinated motion. Their communication remains rich with sound, posture, head rhythm, feathers, small crests, still bound to nests, eggs, breeding seasons, and places that must be protected across many life cycles. And so their civilization does not necessarily rise upward in towers or stretch into straight streets, but may instead spread across the terrain, burrow into rock, embrace the water's edge, cling to plateau slopes, unfold into clusters of reinforced stone nests, dry earth chambers, storage grounds, food processing areas, structures made of bone, wood, mud, shell, and arranged stone. What matters is not whether those structures resemble human dwellings, but what they do for the community. A hollow in the earth may retain warmth, a ring of stones may protect eggs, a cleared path may guide the young safely to water, a field of shells may mark where food was once abundant, an expanded cave may serve at once as shelter, storage, and a meeting place for many groups during the dry season. Civilization, in this form, is not a concrete horizon. It is a landscape touched by memory. Such a civilization would not grow according to the logic of the opposable thumb, the flat tabletop, or symbols inscribed upon bright surfaces. It would grow according to the logic of gripping, hooking, pressing, arranging, remembering, and returning. Their stone tools may become more stable through time, no longer accidental sharp fragments, but forms selected, shaped, preserved, and passed down in use from older individuals to the young. Fire, if controlled or at least maintained at a communal level, may burn within wind-sheltered rock hollows, not only to provide warmth or ward off predators, but to transform a gathering point into a place with its own rhythm of life, where the darkness of night no longer fully belongs to the forest. Their symbols may not be written script upon flat surfaces, yet may still exist as carved marks on stone, clusters of stones arranged with meaning, patches of mineral pigment upon nest surfaces, bones placed at branching paths, shells gathered where memory must persist, like material pauses that help the community orient itself through seasons, roots, taboos, and things too large to be held within a single mind. Above that material layer lies another stratum of information, more fluid, less likely to fossilize, yet no less important sound. Complex sequences of calls, rhythms of warning, signals of gathering, sounds tied to flood seasons, hunting grounds, the presence of other groups, may function as a mobile store of memory, passed from mouth to ear, from posture to response, from one generation to the next. This is not an actual archaeological record, but a line of reasoning grounded in our understanding of social learning, animal behavior, and non-human architecture. The technology here does not strive to resemble ours, it grows out of the body itself. When matter begins to carry memory, society too begins to take on a clearer form, not as a human state, but as a collective body with roles, seasonal rhythms, and its own points of convergence. Within a cycle of such a civilization, morning may begin at the edge of a valley where older individuals bearing the memory of many dry seasons lead the young toward remaining water channels beneath stone. Nearby, juveniles learn to strike, split, and grind stone fragments, not through spoken instruction, but through repeated observation, through slight deviations of a wrist that is not a hand, through the dry sound of stone meeting stone. At the nesting grounds, the guarding group signals at unfamiliar movement. Further away, hunting groups return along paths used for generations, carrying meat, small carcasses, large insects, or the eggs of other species, and the food is distributed according to an order the community has learned to accept. On rock surfaces near cave entrances, carved marks, stone clusters, mineral colours, and remnants of old materials preserve information about roots, dangerous seasons, forbidden places, or rituals that no longer serve only immediate survival. This civilization may have no books, it may have no temples, it may have no statues gazing toward the future with stone eyes, yet it still possesses rules, rituals, traditions, collective memory, shared fears, and shared norms. There are things that are taught, things that are forbidden, places that are guarded, seasons that are awaited, individuals who are trusted more than others. Culture, in that world, is not a layer laid over life. It is the way life organizes itself to endure. And it is here that the question of whether they resemble humans begins to lose its weight. Yielding to a broader one, must a civilization take our form in order to be called a civilization at all? They may not write poetry, nor build cities in grids, nor raise temples toward the sky with symmetrical steps, nor carve their own faces to resist forgetting. Yet they may possess a world of their own, with tradition, symbol, power, memory, and order, a world where matter guides behavior, where sound carries information, where landscapes are shaped by the collective, where what is learned does not die with an individual, but continues to live within the group. Intelligence, then, does not mean becoming another version of humanity. Civilization does not mean repeating our form in another body. It may be a riverbank lined with arranged stones beneath early mist. It may be a cave warmed by fire, marked with mineral colour and deep calls. It may be nests reinforced across generations, paths returned to each season, symbols not written as sentences yet still holding what must be remembered. A handprint does not require a hand. When a non-human civilization has taken shape clearly enough within the ancient haze, the remaining question is not only what it looks like, but whether such intelligence is an inevitable path of evolution, or merely a fragile possibility that once might have blossomed beneath a very different sky. After 66 million years diverging from real history, when the planet in this imagined world has passed through new forests, new climates, new predators, the first tools, the first memories passed between generations, the story no longer stands only before a thinking dinosaur species, but before a broader, quieter, deeper question: is intelligence something evolution inevitably tends toward, or merely a rare branch that life sometimes happens upon? In real history, humans did not emerge as a sudden flash separating animal darkness from the light of civilization, but moved through a corridor almost impossible to grasp, from ancient primate lineages to early hominins, to the genus Homo with its oldest known traces around 2.75 to 2.80 million years ago, and only much later to Homo sapiens. Even the path leading to us was not a straight line, it was a labyrinth. If one branch of real history required so many layers of chance to produce humanity, then in this imagined history, a lineage of intelligent dinosaurs cannot be treated as inevitable simply because a small species survived. It would require a chain of conditions linked like fragile segments, a population small enough to be shaped by selective pressure, yet resilient enough not to vanish, an environment harsh enough to reward memory, yet not so harsh that all cognitive experiments are extinguished, a social life close enough that individuals must remember one another, yet not so chaotic that relationships cannot stabilize, limbs, claws, jaws, eyes, and brains flexible enough to turn experience into new behavior in one world that gives rise to humans, in another it may give rise to a species that is not human, yet still remembers, anticipates, teaches, learns, and leaves its traces upon stone, vegetation, and generations yet to be born. From here, intelligence ceases to be the privilege of a particular body form, and no longer stands as a crown waiting at the end of evolution. A large brain is not automatically a victory, for every neuron demands energy. Every complex process must be paid for in food, developmental time, vulnerability in youth, and quiet trade-offs within the body. Tools do not automatically lead to civilization, for many species can use objects, learn from one another, transmit useful behaviors across generations, yet never accumulate them into a cultural current that grows denser, broader, and increasingly independent of the body that produced it. Society does not automatically become language, though social cognition and communication constantly touch like two currents meeting in darkness. Many elements must converge. The environment must be unpredictable enough. Society must be complex enough. The body must be flexible enough. Memory must last long enough. Learning from one another must be stable enough. When these conditions persist over vast spans of time, intelligence may not emerge as a grand purpose of the universe, but as a temporary solution to a survival problem too intricate, too variable, too dangerous for simple instinct to resolve forever. In other words, intelligence may not be destiny. For most of Earth's history, life has endured without cities, without symbols, without fire kept through the night, without a species that questions itself. Bacteria lived before all brains. Plants covered the continents without consciousness. Insect built complex societies without philosophy. The oceans breathed for hundreds of millions of years without any creature looking up and asking why it exists. Seen at that scale, intelligence does not resemble an inevitable conclusion. It resembles a rare light, costly, fragile, easily extinguished. Yet once it grows large enough, it no longer resides solely within a skull. It inscribes itself upon the planet. It redirects rivers, opens mountains, burns forests, sows seeds, builds dwellings, stores memory outside the body, and turns the world into a long record of itself. Humanity in real history shows that one branch of life can accumulate tools, memory, and society to the point where geology, climate, and the biosphere all bear its imprint. The intelligent dinosaur lineage in this imagined history shows another possibility, not as evidence of what has happened, but as the shadow of what might have happened if history had diverged by a single small point, if one lineage had not vanished beneath the ash of Chicxulub, if breeding seasons had endured longer, if memory had persisted further, if society had thickened, if tools had moved beyond action into tradition. When these two possibilities are placed side by side, the question is no longer which species deserves to become intelligent. The question is whether the universe often gives rise to beings that can ask about the universe itself. Perhaps we're not the only answer. Perhaps we're only the answer of this branch of history on this planet after a sequence of impacts, extinctions, climates, bodies, memories, and chance that led to a species capable of looking back across 66 million years and imagining another world breathing beside its own. The story then ceases to belong solely to dinosaurs or to humans, and becomes the story of life when it grows complex enough to turn back upon itself, fragile enough to know it might never have existed, expansive enough to understand that intelligence is not necessarily destiny, yet not meaningless either. It is a possibility, a rare possibility. From that possibility, the final door does not need to close. It need only open into another dawn, on another planet, within another dream. In that imagined present, where a chain of time stretching across tens of millions of years has settled into a morning that unfolds slowly, quietly, coldly. An ancient valley reveals itself beneath a thin veil of mist, where a river bends gently through stone and soil like a memory never erased. And farther along the slopes lie structures of arranged rock, old shelters, faint trails worn smooth through countless generations, all resting within the first light of day as it gradually spreads, asking for no explanation, demanding no emphasis, existing only as a planet tells its own story without the need for words. That stillness is not emptiness, but what remains after every possibility has already had its chance to be. Feathered bodies emerge from the edge of the mist, so light they scarcely disturb the surface of the water, their eyes reflecting the dim glow of early light, their posture upright yet unstrained, their movements slow yet without hesitation. They pass along the riverbank as though always certain of where they're going, with no urgency, no contest, no pursuit, no remnants of the tense moments of survival that once shaped a distant past. Only the traces of a form of existence that has built, has learned, has changed, and now continues itself in quiet continuity. A morning opens upon a planet that does not belong to humankind, where sound is reduced to the low rhythms of wind, of water, of soft footsteps crossing a surface of earth, remembered through countless returns. Everything gathers into a single thought, simple, yet stretched as long as the very current of time that formed it. An asteroid once fell upon Earth 66 million years ago, enough to erase nearly 3/4 of life, enough to close a world that seemed eternal, yet within that void had only a single branch not vanished, had a single line of evolution shifted ever so slightly. All that followed might have drifted along another course, not louder, not greater, only different. Different to the point of being unrecognizable. That doorway was never entirely sealed. It remains, barely open, just enough to imagine a sky beneath which other beings gaze upward in their own way, where intelligence takes on no familiar form, does not retrace a known path, but moves along its own distinct trajectories, perhaps resembling birds, perhaps bearing traces of primates, or perhaps something entirely beyond comparison. The question lingers longer than the answer, and within that slowness, a realization begins to take shape, not sharp, not absolute, but quietly present like light spreading across the valley, that a deviation so slight within the flow of fate is enough to create another planet, another morning, another dream. Everything comes to rest in stillness, yet does not end, it simply settles.